Hello, welcome to Access, and welcome to the very first look at Mafia 3. I'm joined by the creative director of Mafia 3, Haden Blackman. Really pleased to meet you, Haden. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
And this is the first time you've shown Mafia 3 to the world. And quite clearly, by looking at the trailer and the gameplay you showed us, this is a game you've put your heart and soul into making. How satisfying is it to finally show off your baby to the world?
It's been super gratifying. I mean, nerve-wracking too, but we've been very excited, and I'm really happy with the reception. A little humbled by it. It's been great.
And tell us about Lincoln, because he's your main character in Mafia 3. He seems like quite an intense guy, driven from loyalty to his family, quite a violent character. Tell us about Lincoln's character. What does he bring to the game?
So I think the most important thing to know about Lincoln is that he's an orphan. He spent his entire life looking for some semblance of family, most recently in the Army. So he went off to Vietnam, and he's come back. The other thing, which you already mentioned, is kind of his fatal flaw is his loyalty. So when he comes back from Vietnam, he falls in with the black mob, a mobster who starts treating him like a son, another mobster treats him like a brother, and his loyalty to those guys takes him down a pretty dangerous and dark road as they kind of fall in with the Italian mob, and there's a betrayal and all sorts of things.
I mean, you touched on the world there, New Orleans in the 60s, the jazz music and everything. You know, just give us a brief insight in, I guess it's kind of obvious, but why New Orleans? Why the 60s? What does that bring to this game? I guess it's all about immersing the player in this kind of world of, what does it bring to the game, this world?
So there was lots of different reasons for choosing, a city inspired by New Orleans as our setting. One is the time period. So because we're set in 1968, it's a time of great social change and upheaval in the country. Nowhere maybe more so than in the South. So we wanted to set the game somewhere in the South. Obviously, a city like New Orleans has a really rich history, in terms of everything from pirates to mobsters to, ghost stories. I mean, there's so much to draw on. There's just a wealth of inspiration there. And then it's just, again, it's iconic. You look at a shot of Bourbon Street, and you know that's Bourbon Street from New Orleans. And you look at the swamps, and it gives you that drastically different type of environment. So we were also looking for a place that will give us lots of different types of environments. And then, again, a place where we could tell a story about a character like Lincoln, somebody who is, biracial, who or of mixed race. We actually, in the game, that's one of the questions that's constantly asked is Lincoln's heritage or his background, and it doesn't at the end of the day really matter because he's treated as black because he looks black, but it is something that again helps inform his identity, is that he doesn't really know who he is or where he's from. So, and again, that is part of New Orleans as well, as this kind of very multicultural city, and lots of different groups coming together. So we have that in the game as well.
You mentioned Lincoln was an anti-hero, and we saw him in the trailer. The first thing we saw him doing was feeding a guy to some alligators in a swamp. How challenging is it for you to, get across his character, but still enable players to empathize with Lincoln? Because as you said, he's doing some pretty horrific things in this game, but you want to tell a human story. I guess you want characters to feel and to, put themselves into Lincoln's shoes. How challenging is it for you to kind of balance that kind of
It's something we're always cognizant of, right? And so at the end of the day, we have to start with a character that is driven by motives that we all understand and can relate to, even if we haven't been through his exact experiences, right? So in this case, I think all of us feel like outsiders at some point in time. All of us have felt alone. All of us have, when you don't have a sense of family for whatever reason, you're going to search for that. And for Lincoln, it's very pronounced because, again, he grew up as an orphan and he never really felt like he belonged anywhere. So even if we've only felt a small bit of that throughout our lives, I think it's easy to extrapolate out to what a guy like Lincoln might feel. And then when he has that taken away from him, I think it really gives context and explains why he goes off and does what he does. Now, with that said, we still give the player a lot of freedom to wage that war against the mob in a variety of different ways, and put their own kind of moral code into the game, if you will, if they want, right? So in the demo that we showed tonight, Lincoln went in and took this drug den called the Cistern, and he did so in a very, forceful manner, I think you could say, right? There are other ways to approach that situation in the game if the player so chooses, and we are supporting that. But make no mistake, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a game called Mafia 3. It's about crime. It's about criminals. Lincoln is not out to save the world or change the world. He's on a revenge quest. But in the process, he does build a new empire, and he does change the city, and depending on the way the player plays, maybe for the better.
And talking about a little bit about the world there, it's a fully open world this time.
Yes.
You've mentioned it's inspired by New Orleans,
Right.
but just the look of it, the lighting I especially noticed. How do you approach that kind of thing from an art perspective?
Right.
I guess you take inspiration from the real thing, but you want to put your own artistic stamp on that. You're kind of creating like a mob movie.
Right. Well, and we do look at it in that way in a lot of respects. I mean, I refer to the game sometimes as historical Pulp Fiction. This idea that it's set in a time in history that we're familiar with, and we can reference historical events and certainly social movements in the Vietnam War and the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And all that is part of the backdrop, and it informs our story. But at the same time, we're dealing with fictional characters. Yeah. We're dealing with the criminal underworld with, in some cases, some very salacious subject matter. The drug den that you saw there, they're moving heroin through it. So it does have that kind of historical Pulp Fiction feel. And when I say Pulp Fiction, I mean like the old pulp novels, right? So we do look at it that way, and then we're able to then marry reference with kind of our own creativity, right? So we know that there were restaurant chains in the 60s that weren't always socially sensitive, let's say, right? And would sometimes use racial stereotypes. And so, we have a version of that in the game to make comment on that. We again, built out a version of Bourbon Street that is not identical to Bourbon Street, but has all the things that you would expect in a place like the French Quarter on Bourbon Street, but with our own little touches that allow us to accentuate what we think was important about the time period. And quite frankly, you're looking at the game through the lens of Lincoln, right? So what would Lincoln notice? What are the things that Lincoln would pay attention to? And certainly, a cop harassing an interracial couple is something that Lincoln would take notice of, and that comes front and center in something like the demo.
And you mentioned briefly about the freedom of choice you wanted to give the player. We saw Lincoln taking over the cistern, and he phoned veto, as Mafia fans will remember from Mafia 2. But just going back to that freedom, we saw quite a few styles of gameplay in the demo you showed us. We saw gunplay, we saw stealth. How important is it for you to give players this kind of freedom of choice to how they approach situations like this?
So the freedom of choice is a huge deal for us. We have two kind of mantras as a team. One is every player story is unique, and really it's every player experience is unique, right? We want to craft games that allow players to share stories about how they played the game and have them be different on some level. Another mantra we have is no failure but death. And what that means for us is that we don't want to be overly prescriptive about how you accomplish a mission or objective in the game. Really, what we're trying to do, wherever possible, is give you a series of objectives, give you a bunch of tools, and let you decide how you want to approach those objectives and what tools you want to use. So again, in the example of the demo you saw tonight, the cistern is one possible objective. One way to take over the French ward is by taking over the cistern. That's one part of it. But the player tools are stealth, a huge arsenal that he can draw on, services from his various lieutenants, so muscle. As I said, I think in the demo, we could have gone in guns blazing with our muscle at our side and grenades and blown the heck out of the place, right? So, you could have gone in by boat. That's another tool. Interrogation's a tool because the more guys you interrogate, the more you learn about the hideouts, and the more you can kind of plan out your attack and decide what you want to do. So that's just on that kind of almost kind of moment to moment or minute to minute level, and then we're trying to make sure you have meaningful choice at the macro level, so choices that affect the narrative and the outcome for Lincoln, and then the moment to moment, which is do I take cover here or there? Do I use this weapon or that weapon? Do I do a behind the cover takedown, or do I just bull rush the guy? So. And
I guess one of the challenges of making open worlds like this is you've got so many kind of different systems in there. We saw lots of driving, we saw lots of shooting, lots of stealth. I guess some players could go in and they could hardly touch full-on gun combat and opt for stealth, or vice versa, or hardly touch the driving. How challenging is it for you to make sure you nail each of those systems and make sure they don't feel like things that are just stuck in there, like obviously players will want to be driving cars, but actually make the driving feel like it's part of what this game is supposed to be about.
The key term there is, I think, integration, right? Is making sure all the systems feel really well integrated with one another, right? So we're not doing a lot of extraneous stuff in the game. The driving, if we're going to have it in the game, it's going to be a meaningful part of the game. That was, again, kind of a dictate that I made from the beginning of the game. And so we have a very powerful physics-based driving model. Feels very different than driving in other games. And we wanted to incorporate that in as many ways as possible and really encourage you to drive. Not just to drive around and sightsee, which is fun in its own right, especially with the soundtrack we had, right? But to really use it for gameplay purposes. So, we treat the car as a weapon, right? So I don't know if you noticed in the demo, but at one point, Lincoln bails out of the car and sends it rocketing into a bunch of guys, right? So, we use it as a weapon. We use it for interrogations. That's one way to interrogate guys, is throw them into the passenger seat and drive like a madman. That's literally what we call the feature, is drive like a madman, until they spill their guts. We also have open world activities that rely very heavily on driving, whether that's races or rum running or some other things. So, for us, car culture is an important part of the era. And as you saw, we have these very, memorable muscle cars and whatnot in there that, really help define the era. So, or sports cars or whatever, and there's a wide range of them. So that to us is really important as well, that you feel some attachment to these vehicles.
And it looks like you're trying to tell quite a potent story with Mafia 3, get the player really attached to Lincoln, but also with open world games, some players quite often like to just go off and do their own thing and spend hours just sightseeing and spending time just absorbing the world that is created for them. So what kind of options are you giving to players who just like the pleasure of just existing in one of these amazing worlds?
We do support that. I mean, again, there is a big, vibrant city to explore with lots of different districts that are all varied. But I think what's even more interesting, I mean, the sightseeing I think is going to be great, because hopefully you can see, so far the game is looking beautiful, and like you said, the lighting, and it really captures the feel of the French Ward in that one, or the French Quarter in that one area that you saw. But it's more than even just the sightseeing. It's seeing how the world reacts to Lincoln and to the things that he's doing, to seeing the various types of what we call world interactions that show up in the game that reinforce the time period. So, a Vietnam War protest, for example, that really reminds you. And then the year in 1968. And then it's the criminal ecosystem. And I think that's going to be really interesting to people, because I don't think we've seen anything really quite like this before, where you can go out there and you literally can work your way up the pyramid, right? You can find low-level dealers who will lead you to the drug den, which is run by a hideout boss, who will lead you to the lieutenant, who will lead you to the capo, who will lead you to the mob boss, right? And I think that, to me, is exploration, but in a totally different way than just driving around sightseeing, although I think that's fun too.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much,
Yeah,
Haden.
thank you.
The game is looking absolutely spectacular.
Thank you. I appreciate
Make
that.
sure you check out more on Mafia 3, and please do subscribe, as we're going to have loads more videos coming up all the way through the week on Gamescom.